welcome at this new episode of Peace Today podcast. In this podcast, we always talk to people all around the world who are committed to building a more peaceful and just world. And today is a very special day for me also because I am allowed to talk to one of my examples and, dare I say, heroes, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis is an economist and a politician from Greece. And he rose to international fame, I think, during or after the financial crisis and the negotiations that you had with the EU in order to solve the big problems that Greece was also facing at that time. And I have to say, you must not have a very good feeling about also the Dutch involvement in that process. I mean, I thought it was quite shameful at the time. But anyway, I'm very happy that you're here now.
I'm very happy to be here too, and we must never confuse a government with the people.
No, so let's focus on the government.
So you're not responsible for Dijsselbloem.
No, but I still thought it was, not a very bright part of our national history. Anyway, in this podcast, we try to analyze and look at the world as it is involved in a lot of conflicts and wars. We try to understand why it is that we are facing such big crises at the moment, especially in Ukraine at this moment, in Gaza, but also in places like Congo and Sudan. My first question to you would be, looking at Europe and the EU as it is involved in many of these wars, facing also economic decline, facing also, how can we say, maybe even subjugation to US interest, as we see a lot. Looking around, how would you analyze the situation as well? Where are we in Europe at the moment?
It is imperative not to fragment, not to compartmentalize these different issues. So it's not that there is war in Ukraine and Europe is declining, and there is a wave of increasing warmongering between the United States and China. This is all one thing. It's one unity.
And what is it?
Well, there is no doubt that there is a long wave of imperialism that emanates from Europe. You mentioned the Congo, you mentioned Sudan, you mentioned the Middle East. These are not new conflicts. They are part and parcel of a century-old process whereby European capitalism and later American capitalism, in its bid to expand its markets. Because, let's face it, every single capitalist economy in the history of the world has had an incongruity in its midst. It could produce a lot more stuff, goods, than the populations working in the factories to produce it could consume. So there was always a need to expand markets. That's why we had neo-imperialism. Imperialism not in the sense of the Spaniards taking over from the Incas and massacring them to steal their gold, but expansion of markets. So that has been happening now for 100 years. But we have two new waves of tension creating developments. One is the great financial collapse of 2008, which exposed the architectural design failures of the Eurozone. The Euro was created as if in order to have a major crisis. It was like taking the shock absorbers out of a car and driving it into a pothole. Because when we had our separate currencies, these were shock absorbers. The exchange rate fluctuations could absorb shocks. So we removed those shock absorbers and created a massive macroeconomic imbalance with, when you take a country like Holland or Germany and you bind it together monetarily with a country like Greece or Italy or Portugal, you're going to have a massive increase in the imbalances, which will create bubbles, which will burst, and then you don't have the shock absorbers to absorb it. And unlike the United States, which has a very pragmatic and very flexible system of absorbing crisis. So after 2008, in Washington, D.C., 10 men got around, it was all men, got around the table and asked themselves, what must we do in order not to allow this crisis to consume us? So they started spending trillions and bailing out banks and doing stimulus programs and stuff like that. Here in Europe, we didn't have a federal government. We didn't have the institutions that could create the shock absorption capacities that the Americans have. So instead, they practiced massive austerity, Greece being the guinea pig, but it wasn't the target of austerity. The target of austerity was Germany. It was France. They started with Greece, they experimented on the guinea pig, and then they took it to, if you remember, to Ireland, to Portugal, to Spain, to Italy, to France, and then eventually to Germany. So when you have this massive austerity across Europe, you have a diminution of aggregate demand, you have a collapse of investment. At the same time, you have the European Central Bank that steps in to save the euro and starts printing oodles of money. They give it to the financiers give it to big business, to companies like Alstom and Siemens and BASF and Volkswagen. They look around and they see that people simply are too impecunious to purchase goods and services, so they don't invest. But they take the money from the central bank and they go to the stock exchanges and they buy their own shares. And that increases inequality, it boosts asset price inflation, real estate goes up in Berlin, in Amsterdam and so on, but no investment. And that creates discontent because the quality of jobs diminishes, you have unemployment, even if you don't have unemployment, you have the precarity of the workforce being enhanced. So when you have this discontent within the social fabric of Europe, no investment, and a lot of inequality building up, you get something like the mid-war period. You get the rise of the right, the fragmentation of the ideal of the European Union of getting closer together, of consolidating. No, the opposite happens, it's fragmentation. So you end up with a situation where not even the Chancellor of Germany can play a leading political role in a place like Europe. Meanwhile, you have the United States, which for 20 years now has been looking, it wasn't just Trump, it was even the Obama administration that looked at the European Union as a threat to the United States, even though it was a creation of the United States in the 1950s with the Marshall Aid Plan and so on. The United States at some point realized that the business model of Europe was becoming a mercantilist one based on net exports, primarily to the United States. And they could see, especially after 2008, that Europe was not pulling its weight to help ameliorate the capitalist crisis that started in 2008. And I remember talking to the finance minister of Obama, Jack Lew, at the time, and he was behind closed doors, of course, confiding in me his view that Europe was exporting deflation to the United States. And it was around that period, 2010, 2011, 12, 13, that the pre-existing tendency to expand NATO starts shifting into Ukraine. When you have Victoria Nuland planning a coup d'etat against the Yanukovych government, quite explicitly. And we know from WikiLeaks, we have the recording, when she's asked, she's told that the Europeans have a problem with what America is doing in Ukraine because it is antagonizing Putin, it is creating the circumstances for a conflagration in Eastern Europe. And she says, fuck the Europeans. That reminded me of a discussion I had with a former chief of staff of NATO, who was a colleague of mine after he retired at the University of Texas in Austin. And I remember asking him, he was a chief of staff of NATO once, and I said to him, why do we need NATO in Europe now, after the end of the Cold War? And he said, well, 3 reasons. To keep Germany down, to keep us in, the United States, and to keep Russia down. So you can see how the failure of Europe to consolidate, to deal with the euro crisis, the way in which these failures exacerbated the political fragmentation of Europe, meant that, in a sense, Europe became ripe for becoming a vassal state or a vassal continent caught between the United States and Russia. So look at the result of this. Today, if there is a peace conference on Ukraine, who's going to represent Europe? We simply don't have anyone. I mean, once upon a time it would be Merkel. In 2014, when the first clash between Ukraine and Russia started, she flew there, she dealt with it, she was leading. She was a leading Western politician with Nuland. Now we don't have anyone because Macron and Scholz are lame ducks. Whoever succeeds Scholz will also be a lame duck from day one. We used to have a north-south divide in Europe, now we have also an east-west divide. So this is a very long answer to your question, but the gist is simple. Europe is becoming irrelevant, and we are falling prey to our incapacity to consolidate at a time when the United States, within their own establishment, they have one simple disagreement between themselves, between the Trumpists and the standard establishment. They both agree that they need to start, and they have started, a new Cold War against China, which may turn hot. Their only disagreement is Ukraine, because you've got the realists, who include Trump, interestingly, who say, well, we can't have two fronts, and Ukraine is a distraction, and we're pushing Russia into the arms of China. Forget the Europeans, I can deal with them by means of tariffs. I don't need to continue with this war in Ukraine. And you've got the liberal establishment that want two fronts, one in Europe and one in China. And Europe is incapable of even having this conversation. I mean, we're simply led down the garden path like sheep are being led to the slaughterhouse.
This is indeed a very large and elaborate answer that already sort of touches on other things that I wanted to ask. And one of the things that surprised me actually always is, first, what you said, actually you point to 2008 actually as a pivotal moment for you. If I trying to understand you correctly,
yes, I think that everything changed in 2008. It was our generations, your generations, 1929. Yeah. In the same way that 1920 paved the ground for the mid-war period, for the fascist rise, for militarism, for war, it's your generation's 1929.
Exactly. So what, let's say, if we would have taken more sensible decision in 2008, what would have also prevented us from being both a vassal state, being involved in conflict in Ukraine? You think so? If we could have. And what was the exact decision that we could have and should have taken as a EU at that point in time?
It's very simple. Federate. Federate or go our separate ways. Because you see, the mistake was, it wasn't a mistake, it was, there were vested interests involved in making this decision. But if you take a step back and look at Europe, you realize the monstrosity of what we've done. We've created federal money without a federal government. We created one central bank for 19 countries and 19 countries without a central bank. Now, you only have to state this to realize the madness involved. This is never going to work well. It's always going to end up in tears. Because when you... I mentioned 1929. There was something similar before 1929. It was the gold standard. The gold standard was an attempt, essentially, to bind all currencies together, fixed exchange rates, bind them to the price of gold, and have one currency which reflects the price of gold. And we saw how that ended. At the beginning, you've got irrational exuberance because deficit countries now have a hard currency so they can borrow from the surplus countries like Holland, countries like Germany. Okay, that creates a flood of debt that goes into the deficit countries, that gives an impression, a false impression of growth. Okay, then
because it's all debt.
Everybody thinks this is a new paradigm and the sky is the limit. And then at some point, reality takes its revenge and the bubble bursts, and then you've got unpayable debts, and then you have conflict, and then you end up with war. Right? So we repeated that by creating the euro. Now, the sensible thing would have been to federate, and once we federate, you can have a federal money. Okay, we didn't do it that way. We federated our money first. 2008 was a remarkable opportunity. Crises are opportunities as well. This is a cliche, which is true. To reverse or to complete what Mitterrand, the former president of France, and Delors, his finance minister and then the most significant president of the European Commission, was talking about, because there was a meeting sometime in 1992 at the time of Maastricht. And I know that because a good friend of mine was at that meeting. That meeting involved only 3 people, yes. 4 people. One of them was my friend who was an advisor to Jacques Delors. And I mention that because I think it helps frame the answer to your question, what could we have done differently? Yeah. At the time, they had agreed that they would introduce the euro with the Maastricht Treaty and all that. And Delors, being quite smart, I had many political disagreements with him, but he was a smart person. Right? He understood that if you build a eurozone with one leg, the central bank, it's very unstable. It's like a giant with one leg. You need 2 legs at least. 4 would be better. And the second leg should be an institution that essentially provides the eurozone with its growth pillar. So you have the monetary pillar, the ECB, and you should have a growth pillar, a common investment program. And he proposed a particular investment program that will be centered around the European Investment Bank, which is important, but it is insignificant because it's too small for the size of the eurozone. And he was suggesting ways of making it big. And essentially creating common debt for the purposes of investment through the European Investment Bank and so on. And the reason I'm telling you that is because there was this very interesting conversation in a room somewhere in Brussels. So it was Delors, Mitterrand, and Stuart Holland, my friend. And Delors was trying to convince Mitterrand about the importance of creating this pillar as a first step towards federation. And the old fox, François Mitterrand, listened very carefully and then thought about it for a bit. And he turned around and he said, this is a very good idea, but we can't do it. And we can't do it because Helmut Kohl and I, Helmut Kohl being the chancellor at the time, we don't have the political power to do both, to do a common aggregate investment program and common money. But then he added something really very important. This is the answer to your question. He said, but when the next international global financial crisis hits in around 10 years, he even mentioned it was more than 10 years, but he was predicting 10 years, then our successors will have to do that because it's the only way of saving it. So he was counting on an international global financial crisis to force the political personnel of the European Union to complete the federation. But it didn't happen. Instead, you had Merkel and various minions around her, like Sarkozy and Papandreou and all these poor excuses for leaders, who effectively did everything they could they changed everything in order to make sure that nothing changes. And we missed that opportunity. Had we proceeded with that, imagine a speech from Merkel saying that, we're facing a major financial challenge. which can only be overcome by bringing Europe together. And let's have a common investment program, and so on and so forth. And let's start working towards a federation. Now that would have really changed the world, not just Europe. But we didn't have leadership of that sort. And in a sense, the imperative of saving the bankers overruled everything else. But in saving the bankers, we created the tensions and the discontent in Europe, which created the fragmentation, which then made us a sitting duck when it comes to warmongering.
How could we have chosen for the bankers? I mean, yeah, well, but what? Yes, but what was their incentive to do that? Did they oversee the effect that it could have had? Did they understand what they were doing at the time? Do you think, by saving the bankers instead of saving the EU, basically?
I can't answer the question of what these people understood. I don't know. But what I can tell you is this. The politicians that would have told the bankers where to get off had left the political scene by 2010. And there is a reason for that. If you look at the Scandinavian countries in 1992, when the banking system of the whole of Scandinavia went pear-shaped, they all went bankrupt. In Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway. They did not succumb to the pressure of the bankers. The bankers, every time the bankers have a bankruptcy problem, they push the politicians to bail them out. Now, the Scandinavian countries didn't bail them out. They bailed the banks out, but they got rid of the bankers. Effectively, they nationalized the banks and kept them for a few years. And then, when the crisis was over, they sold them back to the private sector, but not to the same bankers, to other bankers. The South Korean government did this after 1998, the great Southeast Asian banking collapse. But between the early 90s and the early 2000s, something changed. Financialization. What does that mean? It means that the center of gravity of capitalism in the West shifted, both in the United States and in Europe, shifted from industry to finance. So, once upon a time, to be really powerful, you had to be Henry Ford, to be producing stuff. Thomas Edison. Same in the 1960s with IBM and so on. You had to be producing goods and some services. Now, by the late 1990s, power rested in the hands of the financiers. You had to be Deutsche Bank, you had to be Goldman Sachs, you had to be Barclays Bank, right? With deindustrialization happening at the same time, you had, and the philosophy of this, of course, is known as neoliberalism, but this is just the ideological cover for what was going on. So, even social democrats, who had a genuine concern for social justice, for redistributing income, the SPD in Germany, in Austria, even Mitterrand himself. He tried it in the first 2 years of his presidency between 1981 and 1983. He even tried Keynesianism, he tried to redistribute income, and the financial markets destroyed him. So he adopted austerity, and he gave up on the social democratic agenda. And they had to give up because when power shifts from industry to finance, you can no longer sit around the table, the captains of industry and the trades unionists, and say, come on, let's find some way of, mediating between you. You can't really put the financiers on the one side of the table and the trades unions on the other. What are they going to discuss? It's, they are not even the same realm. So the solution that social democratic governments and liberal governments with a social democratic dimension within them, the solution that they found was to say, okay, the government and the politicians will deal with the financiers, and there will be a Faustian bargain between them. So the politicians would let the bankers do whatever they want. That is, they would unleash them, they would unshackle them from all regulation, with financial derivatives, the weapons of mass financial distraction, as Warren Buffett described, financialization. Let them do whatever they want, but they will give us a cut from their huge profits, the crumbs of their table, for the welfare state.
It's quite incredible.
And and for them, and that worked. Tony Blair increased massively the funding of the National Health Service and so on, because he went into bed, so to speak, proverbially, with the City of London. And also, in the process of cultivating those relationships, it was the bankers who paid for their electoral campaigns. So they became so intertwined, which means that at the moment when, in 2007, 2008, the banks collapsed and the phone rang, and there was the banker on the other side that had financed your hospitals, your campaign, your personal political career, okay, and he demanded that you bail him out. Those politicians who were in power had neither the analytical skills nor the moral backbone to say bugger off to them, which is what they should have said.
De facto, in 2008, we've given sovereignty of our countries to let's say, the banking class.
We had done that before. What we did in 2008 was we shifted their losses onto the shoulders of the weakest taxpayers.
So this was the result.
And that is the beginning of the rise of the fascists, of the ultra-right wing, because the discontent was not harvested by the left, by us, because we failed, and it was harvested by the ultra-right.
So we are in deep trouble. It's quite obvious, and we can say already earlier than 2008. It was merely the result of this Faustian bargain, as you said, that we transferred actually our sovereignty, our power from democratically elected governments to a banking class, let's say, and that could then demand anything of the. I've always wondered why we have such weak politicians, but this is actually.
It's an evolutionary process. You see, it's not nothing to do with the DNA of people. What happens is, as power shifts from industry to finance, the role of the politician is constrained. Either you're going to clash with the financiers, or you're going to not become a politician. If you're a smart person, why would you want to be prime minister or president or minister in a government that bestows next to no leeway to you to do things because you're effectively in the pocket of bankers? Yeah. So if you were in the 60s a smart woman or man who wanted to make a difference in the world, to have power, to do things, some would have good intentions, some would have ill intentions. Now, being president or prime minister was a very attractive thing because you had degrees of freedom. Okay, but in the 1990s, if you really wanted to have power, you had to imagine becoming the CEO of Deutsche Bank, not the Chancellor of Germany. So that is the Darwinian process which selects the unfit to be politicians.
The ones prepared to...
Inverse Darwinian process, I should say.
People who are prepared to serve another class, let's say, prepared to...
Yeah, they're the people that used to go into middle management, now go into politics.
There's so many questions I'd like to ask, but one of them is like, how much, or what's the interest of this class in a war like Ukraine or in committing a genocide in Gaza? What is their interest? Why do, apparently they're pulling the strings behind also the scenes in Europe. What's their interest? What's in it for them?
Well, I don't think they have an interest. It's worse than we think. You know, I would prefer my opponents to be conviction politicians who will truly believe in that. I mean, they're not Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher really believed in what she did. She believed in the Falklands War. Now, these bozos that are running Europe now, I don't think they believe in anything. I don't even think they believe in the way in which the European Union has persecuted the war in Ukraine. Their concern is not to suffer from the Australians have a nice expression, the tall poppy syndrome. There's a poppy that sticks out, and if anyone with a stick goes down and just cuts it down, they don't want to step out of the herd. The herd is being pushed in a particular direction by Washington. The war in Ukraine is a Washington project and a Putin project. Putin and Washington. Europe was never consulted. It was the European policy. But once it began, they simply fell inside into the stride of the herd, the NATO herd. And you can see that from the fate of people like Macron and Scholz. Neither of them believed that it was a sensible thing to try to espouse the strategy that Ukraine must be pushed into an all-out war until Moscow falls. I mean, you could see it. Macron tried. He talked to one person, he talked to another person. Scholz was sitting on the fence. He's a well-known fence sitter. But their careers faced Armageddon if they didn't fall in line with a hardcore strategy that Putin has to be tried in the International Criminal Court, which means taking Moscow, which means that Ukraine, without boots on the ground, would have to win the war on its own, which is just utter madness. And I'm sure they all knew about that. But, you know, this is the side of the bread that is buttered for them. So, in other words,
but the financial
I don't
class.
see evil. I see banality in Hannah Arendt's sense of the term.
Evil, the banality of evil. Yeah. But it's then the choice between their career and the self-destruction of Europe. It's quite an. Where do you see it headed if this continues like this, without any change whatsoever? What's the future of Europe?
My view is that Europe is in a long-term path of secular stagnation. This is not a crisis like a standard capitalist fluctuation where you have capitalism going through a recession, going to a depression, then recovery, and a sine wave kind of. It's not that. I think that we have entered a 100-year long, 1 century long at least, secular decline. We have missed the latest industrial revolution, which is based on green energy, renewables, and what I call cloud capital, that is algorithmic capital, digital technologies, reinforcement, learning, algorithms, and AI. We are behind. That is, we missed that train, and we can't catch it. And there's no mechanism by which to catch it now.
Why did we miss that train, by the way?
Well, we missed it because of the way we treat it.
Disinvestment.
Yeah, exactly. It's the way we mishandle the euro crisis. Because the mishandling of the euro crisis, I explained that before, brought about an investment strike. So for 15 years we haven't invested when China and the United States was investing like crazy. We're investing like crazy. And now you can see that the political fragmentation is not allowing us to have the conversation that would be necessary, would be a prerequisite for catching up. So take Germany, for instance. They have a federal election coming up. Nobody's talking about what needs to be talked about. I mean, they're all talking about subsidizing their existing industries. It is a little bit like, you remember, you don't remember, you're too young, but in the 1970s, those of us who were trying to write our thesis and so on, university and so on, we had these very nice electric typewriters. I remember I had an Olivetti. It was very nice. You could write quite nice, beautifully. You had a ball thing that was typing very fast on pieces of paper. Now, that industry was killed off by the PC, naturally. It's like having this Olivetti typewriter. You can see the end coming, and you are talking about the competitiveness, bolstering the competitiveness of this factory through wage cuts, through government subsidies. There is no wage cut. Even if wages go to zero, these typewriters would die. There is no subsidy you can give them. Because it's not simply a matter of evolving it into a PC. You need to scrap it and start something new. And nobody's having this conversation in Europe. Once upon a time, we used to say that, okay, there's not much investment in Europe, but at least the United States innovates, China imitates, and Europe regulates. And you gain a position at the table through regulation. Well, now you've got China innovating. You saw what happened with DeepSeek last week. You have the United States innovating and imitating. And you have Europe stagnating and continuing to imagine that through regulation they can achieve that which only serious aggregate investment would bring about. But the aggregate investment pillar of the giant that is Europe was never constructed, going back to the 1992 discussion involving Iran.
So we are in many respects in deep trouble, and this leads us to go down the line that you just described, of decline, and also being sort of the helping hand for the US in all its imperialist adventures, which are disastrous for the populations of Gaza and also Ukraine and other places. We all want to know how to reverse this, because it's a future of doom, it seems. And it seems also that these powers that have created the system as it is, they have a vested interest in continuing it like this. The industries wants to be subsidized and to continue making these Olivettis that nobody is going to use anymore. And it seems that everything you're going to say is we need some sort of revolution. Even there's no, as you say, there's no real debate about this. So also in the Netherlands, I can say we don't ever discuss the political, the economic problems in Parliament. Nobody is sort of doubting that we are on a wrong economic track or something like that. We all talk about migration. It has become worse, of course, with the right-wing government that we have. So we want to know how to get out of this, how to reverse history, not necessarily to give Europe a position of power, but at least to have some independence, some more like that you can know that you vote for a politician that can actually change something. And so what are there's so many things that need to happen. Where to start? What's the priority? What should we do in order to start making a change?
Well, our movement, DiEM25, which I'm here to represent in our meetings, we failed in answering this question. Our answer in 2019, after 2 years of hard work, was the Green New Deal for Europe, where we tried to articulate and answer the question, what should Europe be doing differently? And that failed because in this noisy environment where, on the one hand, you've got the liberal establishment saying business as usual, when business cannot be maintained as usual. And then you have the ultra-right where migration is the anti-Semitism. What anti-Semitism was in the 1930s, migration is now the hatred of the migrant, of the other. Squeezed in between those two, our Green New Deal for Europe was never even discussed. And it can't be discussed now because we missed every opportunity that we had. We missed the pandemic. That was another opportunity after the Euro crisis to consolidate, to have aggregate investment and so on. So I'll answer your question spontaneously by saying that the struggle for a just peace in the Middle East to liberate Palestine is our best bet. And the reason I'm saying this is the following. You can see that over the last year and a half of the genocide and the ethnic cleansing in Palestine, you can see that the complicity of the European mindset, of the European establishment in that genocide is bringing this whole establishment into a dead end. They themselves have been pushed so much by their own complicity to a moral void. They can feel it now. I can see that even those who are continuing to identify Europe with the defense of whatever Israel does, you can see that they are feeling uncomfortable with their position. Noam Chomsky once said, and I think that was very prescient a long time ago, that unless Palestine is free, the Americans won't be free. I think we need to bring this back as an idea, because Palestine is a European problem. We created the problem in Palestine. We created the problem of anti-Semitism, the pogroms against the Jews, that led to the Holocaust. We are responsible. We Europeans are responsible for the plight of the Jewish people. We Europeans are responsible for the monstrous idea that the solution to the problem we created, to our crimes of anti-Semitism, can be sorted out by taking a land which is not ours, to declare it terra nullius, free of people, and saying, okay, we'll send the Jews there. And we will support them to do whatever they want. So, we compound one atrocity with another atrocity, as if two atrocities make one right. They don't. It doesn't. So, because the youth of Europe have become alerted, they are now cognizant of the crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated with the complicity of the European Union in Palestine. I think that the pro-Palestinian rallies and the peace movement in Europe, concentrating on a just peace in the Middle East, is a wonderful opportunity to recalibrate politics in Europe. And to the extent that we are successful in defeating the genocidal policies of the European Union in Palestine, we will be successful in reviving progressive politics in Europe for the sake of Europeans in Europe.
It's remarkable. Also, whatever has happened in Gaza, with the complicity, with the weapons, the money of countries like the Netherlands, Germany, many other countries, it has been as terrible and shocking as it has been. It has also been it has been an educational shock educational process for many of us to learn how things work, how power is exerted, how our own system functions.
Exactly. That's exactly my point.
Yeah. You said previously, when you want to go into politics now, also this generation that is now sort of politicized and awakened sort of for how things work, you have to be prepared to fight against the financial class.
Either that, or you sell your soul.
Yeah, well, let's not sell our soul. I'm looking for ways to not sell our soul, yes, and save morality, save the common good, create again the idea of equality, those kind of things. How can we fight this system? How can we fight the financial system how can we reduce the power of these elements in our lives?
At many different levels. Mm-hmm. So, in your own neighborhood, when a family is being thrown out by a bank, you can support them. Mm-hmm. You can create a picket line in front of the house to stop the bailiffs from coming in. So this is something you could do in your own neighborhood. You can then aim high as well, at the larger picture, and you can start questioning and asking other people to question the legitimacy of having banks that control your money. Because this is something else which we take for granted, but it is preposterous, come to think of it. I mean, if an extraterrestrial arrived on Earth and looked at the way that the banks have a monopoly on your payments. You go to a cafeteria here, okay, in The Hague, and you pay for a coffee. To pay for a coffee, you have to have a bank account. You have to have a card that is issued by a bank. So essentially, your own money, not in terms of savings or financial products, but to use your own money, you need to essentially give it to a banker who charges you for using your money. That is madness. Now, we live in a world full of applications, of apps, of digital technologies. We know that the marginal cost of transactions is zero. It costs them nothing to transfer, €3 from your account to the cafeteria's account. Nothing. And still, they are using it as a way of collecting rents, financial rents from the whole rents. Now, why can't we start a movement for socializing the payment system? And it's not unheard of. Already in China, there are 200 million accounts, offered digital accounts. You download them from an app that are offered by the central bank. I mean, why does the ECB give you the opportunity to download an account, to create an account with it, like you create an account with Google or with Meta or whatever, and to tell your employer, I want my salary in there, and then you have a PIN and you can transfer money to whoever you want using, these taxless payments. Why can't we have that? If we had that, suddenly the bankers would have to actually offer you something useful to convince you to park your money with them. And then you can take it even further. If we create such a payment system, then why can't, once we park this money there, which effectively is parked with the central bank, this is like you lending money to the state. Why can't you get the interest rate of the central bank, which is much higher than a commercial bank would give you? So our party, for instance, in Greece, which is affiliated to DiEM25, it's called Meta25, we are putting forward this proposal for creating a public, free, digital payment and saving system. So this is another level at which you can take the fight against the monopoly of the bankers. They hate it because they understand that it is so rational and so technologically feasible and useful that they can feel that the earth is sort of shifting from under their feet, and that's why they demonize us. But this is what I'm talking about, clashing with finances in order to reclaim a modicum of a possibility, of an iota, of a possibility of democracy.
Yeah, and I've been thinking the similar things about like mortgages, etc. The power of banks in the pricing of houses and etc. So I would be at another time. We don't have enough time, but at another time I would really be interested to see what kind of laws would we need in order to keep the financial system down again, or to keep it at its proper place.
I'm a libertarian Marxist. I know people balk when they hear that, but Marx was a libertarian too. I don't believe in laws that much.
Oh, really? Okay.
I believe in. Imagine if you could download on your phone this app, which is publicly owned, and it's provided to you by the central bank, right? Either your countries or even the Eurozone. Okay, and you can do everything freely. The banking system would wither and die. Okay. You don't need to legislate against them. Let them, let's be liberal. Let them do what they want. Suddenly, people will be free from the need to park their money with them.
Yeah, if you talk about laws, you trust government and to regulate, but actually you say we should claim our own space where
we should socialize. We create a new monetary commons. That's what I call it.
Great. Final question, and I appreciate a lot how you explain, because it makes so much sense, and I think maybe the first question, maybe two questions. Why has the left, the let's say nominal left, as it exists and it's maybe not really left, why have they not been able to explain like a story like this? Why have they? Because actually I was wondering, like, it's all about narratives, we all deal with problems and they all have causes, and we can fight the causes and solve the problems. And actually one running narrative is only that migrants are a problem or Muslims are a problem. How come the left cannot explain like you do what our problem is and how to solve it?
Because they went into bed with the banking system. If you look at the SPD in Germany, if you look at the Labour Party in Britain, if you look at my former colleagues of Syriza in the government in which I served, they all essentially became co-opted by the banking system. They accepted the monopoly of the bankers over our money, and they accepted the logic of bailing them out for different reasons. Some of them did it enthusiastically, others were put under a lot of pressure, like my colleagues in Greece were. But once you start telling people that, you know what, this is the way things should be with the banking system, then how can you explain to them the travesty that the banking monopoly over your money is? You can't do both. So then you end up with a radical centrist kind of line that we live in the best of all possible worlds, which can only be marginally improved by, you know, giving a few more euros to the dispossessed, and, you know, allowing people to change their pronouns, you know, those things which, to the people who can't make ends meet, who are angry about that, it's all irrelevant. And then some Hitler-esque chap or woman, as in the case of Italy or France, gets up on a soapbox and says, I feel your pain. I know you can't make ends meet. I know that things are terrible. And I will tell you what the problem is. It is the Jew or the Muslim or the foreigner or, you know, the German or the Greek. And give me absolute power and I will make you proud again. Well, we've been through this in the mid-war period, haven't we?
Exactly. Final last question. We have to close this discussion, which is too interesting. What's your message to all those people who are actually desperate, don't see how to solve the many problems that we're in, and desire to live in a world where we have justice and peace? What would your message be to the people who are doubting maybe that it's possible?
Resistance is fun, and it is never futile.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Yanis Varoufakis.